Chapter 9. Miss Maple Investigates. Glendalough, for instance, said the strange woman. The saint goes off there to live alone and be a hermit, and the moment people find out about it, he can hardly move for pilgrims. The most popular place of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. And why? Because human beings are herd animals. You have to make them believe everyone's coming here, and if they believe it, then everyone will come here. It's that simple. She took a bite of her buttered scone and smiled at the same time. Her dress was as red as autumn berries. A whole basketful of buttered scones lay in front of her, neatly covered with a napkin to keep the flies away, but the sheep could smell them all the same. The woman dipped her scone first in softly whipped cream, then in red jam. She poured tea from the teapot into a plastic cup, added 2 brown sugar cubes, and then some more cream. The scones, jam, tea, sugar, and cream were set out on a huge, brightly checked picnic tablecloth. There was also a bottle of orange juice, some cream cheese, biscuits, toast, a little pot of mayonnaise, and a bowl of tomato salad with chopped parsley. The cloth itself covered a small part of the sheep's meadow close to the cliff tops, luckily spread over a place where the interesting plants had already been grazed. The bright colors alarmed the sheep. They were nervous anyway, because after his summery dance with the magpie, Gabriel had left them to their own devices. Aromas that they had never guessed at wafted over the meadow and tempted their nostrils. They kept a safe distance, but they squinted with undisguised greed at the basketful of scones and tomato salad. Beside the cloth sat Bible-bashing Beth, a black picture of uneasiness with slender wrists and a tidy hairdo, trying to make her full skirt take up as little space as possible. She wasn't eating anything, but sometimes her hand moved to her breast and closed around a small, glittering object there. When she did that, the pot of mayonnaise wobbled. Belief, she sighed now. Belief is never easy. Not your own belief, no. Other people's beliefs are very easy. The strange woman laughed. Ha ha ha. Her second scone received its baptism of cream. Do help yourself, she said. Beth silently shook her head. Her eyes wandered to the dolman. You really ought to have some, said the woman. They're good. You don't look as if you eat much usually, she added, glancing at Beth's thin, hairy arms. No, said Beth firmly. I don't eat much usually. I live next door to a takeaway. If you see people stuffing themselves senseless instead of thinking about the salvation of their souls, it spoils your appetite. Unimpressed, the woman bit into her scone with relish. Do you know the really strange thing? She went on, a little indistinctly, because she hadn't finished chewing her scone yet. Do you know just when people will believe everyone's coming here? When you persuade them it's an isolated place. That convinces them. Everyone's after isolation. If a place is isolated, crowds of people just have to come rushing to enjoy it. Beth stared blankly straight ahead. The little pot of mayonnaise wobbled. Maud was thinking how unpleasant Beth smelled, both sour and sweetish. She smelled of long starvation and early death. She was spoiling Maud's pleasure in the aromas rising from the bright check tablecloth. I really don't understand why you're worried, though. It didn't seem to bother the red woman that Beth smelled nasty and was silent. It's absolutely dreamy here. Anyone would feel good in this place. I don't, said Beth. No one from Glenkill would feel good. Terrible things have happened here. I shouldn't just say so. I ought to convince you of it. But I do say so all the same. I'm not going to be intimidated anymore. The Lord is with me. Terrible things? Asked the woman, unfazed. All the better. People just love terrible things. A saint tortured by heathens? Great. A heathen chucked into the sea by saints? Even better. When it comes to crime, you can hardly go wrong in the tourist trade. The Red Woman had no problem with words. Cordelia listened to her admiringly. This woman was full of stories. Beth swallowed. It sounded like a suppressed giggle, but anyone looking into Beth's face could guess that it must have been a desperately concealed sob. The woman noticed and turned serious. You mean the murder? I'm so sorry. I didn't know it happened here. She put her half-eaten scone back on the picnic cloth. It didn't happen here, said Beth in a graveyard voice. The little pot of mayonnaise wobbled yet again. Was he a relation of yours? A boyfriend? The Red Woman's voice sounded gentle now. Beth shook herself. Not a relation. Certainly not a boyfriend. He'd have laughed at the mere idea. He always laughed at me. But we were at the village school here together. It was a terrible death. A heathen death. I've read about it in the paper, said the Red Woman thoughtfully. With a spade? Not nice, but you really don't have to worry that it'll make any difference to the tourists, although an arrest would be a good thing, of course. Do they have a suspect yet? The Red Woman reached for the tomato salad. A soundless sigh went through the flock of sheep. They were more interested in the tomato salad than any of the other things on the picnic cloth. They had hoped the woman would overeat on scones and leave the tomato salad behind ungrazed. At present, the outlook was not hopeful. Some say it was about money or drugs or even worse. Beth flushed red. But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is there's someone going around here in Glen Hill. Her voice rose to a higher register so that she didn't really sound like Beth anymore. The sheep jumped and twitched their ears nervously. A human being like anyone else on the outside, but a wild beast inside, eaten away by such sickness of the soul, such godlessness, such despair. Beth stared into the eyes of the stranger, who held her gaze unflinchingly for a moment. Then the strange woman stuck her fork into the bowl of tomato salad and brought out a tiny whole tomato. The sheep had never seen such small tomatoes. Even the stunted tomatoes in George's vegetable plot, George had never been particularly successful with tomatoes, were giants by comparison. But they had an aroma just like a big tomato, a delicious aroma, and they were disappearing rapidly between the Red Woman's immaculate teeth. Now that Beth had started to talk, there was no stopping her. You see, it's an ordinary, logical sort of murder, not the kind you see on TV, where it's all about money or power. I can just feel it. I distribute tracts, you see, wonderful writings about the gospel, and if you do that long enough, you get a feeling for what people are like. You may laugh at me, but I have that feeling. Beth's voice, which didn't sound at all like Beth's voice anymore, trembled, but the woman's hand didn't as she raised her fork to her mouth, with 2 little tomatoes on it. I can tell you such things. This murder is to do with souls. I can say that much. It's a matter of guilt. Whoever did it knew what's right and what's wrong, but wasn't strong enough to do the right thing. It's so terrible when you don't have the strength to do the right thing. You feel like cutting your own weakness out of yourself with a knife. A knife. But the weakness is still there. And a time comes when you don't see any option but to destroy what's strong, destroying what you can't achieve. That's the worst of human sins. God be with me. Beth had spoken directly to the heavens, with her head raised as if she had entirely forgotten the Red Woman. But now the two of them were looking at each other again. The woman's eyes had narrowed. A fork with 2 more baby tomatoes was hovering in front of her red lips. Forgotten. Beth's eyes were round and wide as a child's, and she was smiling sadly. For a second, the sheep forgot about the tomatoes too. They had never seen Beth smile before. She looked pretty, or better than usual anyway. I can imagine that seems strange to you, but I do have a feeling for these things. The red woman shook her head. She was going to say something, but Beth didn't let her get a word in edgeways. A Beth who wouldn't let someone else get a word in edgeways was something entirely new. You see, I spoke to the police. I was the only one who did, too. Imagine that, a whole village, and I'm the only one to ask the police about it. We'll all stifle in silence here. Beth took a deep breath. Well, then, the police say George was poisoned first. He fell asleep peacefully. Then came the spade. When he was already dead, you understand? The question is why? And the CID from town probably don't think anything much of that. But I've been going from door to door with my pamphlets for years. I know what heathens the people here are at heart. 2 red lips closed round 2 equally red tomatoes. There's an old superstition, you know. If someone dies, you shouldn't come too close to the body for the first hour. They say the hounds of the devil are on watch, waiting to swallow the dead person's soul. And George's soul belonged to the devil. Oh dear, yes. Can you imagine what horror that lost soul must have felt beside the body, with the spade? Can you guess what it takes to overcome that horror? You say the murder won't affect the tourist trade, but I can feel that Glenkill won't be able to live again until the black sheep has finally left our flock. Beth rose abruptly, with surprisingly flowing movements. Othello gave her a nasty look. Once on her 2 hind legs, Beth lost that little touch of elegance as quickly as it had come. Well, if you have any questions about the tourist openings, then please come to the parish office. Open daily from 10 to 12, 9 to 12 on Wednesdays. She was going to turn, but the red woman gently took her by the sleeve. Her eyes were still narrowed. And I don't suppose you have questions about George? She whispered, looking up at Beth. In a deep voice, a husky, beautiful voice, a voice for reading aloud. Beth froze. Once again, her eyes searched the spotlessly blue sky. When she finally looked down at the woman, there was the hint of a smile on her lips. In that case, she whispered, come and see me this evening. The blue house opposite the church. The takeaway is at the front. I live in the back. Beth turned and was soon only a sharply outlined black silhouette, getting smaller and smaller against the background of the afternoon sky. The red woman, motionless, watched her go. The last tomato lay forgotten in the salad bowl. Othello had got the last tomato. He stood there dreamily watching the strange woman pack away all the rest of the fodder in her basket and stroll thoughtfully along the cliff tops towards the village. Envious sheep faces surrounded him. How did Othello always know what to do? Who had taught him to get on with humans so well? How did he know simply to stand there in front of the woman, not pushy but not shy, just as she was going to put the salad bowl back in the basket? The woman had laughed in her kind, husky, George-like way and held the bowl out to Othello, and Othello had eaten the last baby tomato at his leisure. Now the sheep were in a bad mood. None of them would have dared to do what Othello did, particularly with a woman who was a complete stranger, but they all grudged him that tomato. Only Miss Maple was looking reflective. She even grazed her way right past an excellent patch of clover, which showed just how deep in thought she was. She's not stupid, murmured Miss Maple, more to herself than any of the other sheep. That's not stupid. She thinks too much of souls and not enough of human beings, but she's not stupid. The red woman isn't stupid either, said Othello, almost a touch too proudly. Oh no, Miss Maple nodded. The red woman isn't a bit stupid. I'd never have expected George to have a child, said Maud. You did smell it, didn't you? Several sheep had now joined the interesting conversation between Maple, Othello, and Maud. They nodded. The family scent, sweat and skin and hair, unmistakably George's daughter. We don't know what it means, said Cordelia. To sheep, the identity of the ram who sired them is of no importance, but who knew if it was the same with human beings? There had been a father in one of the Pamela novels who locked up his daughter so that she couldn't run off with some baron. That apple pie Pamela isn't her mother anyway, said Cloud. Once again they looked at each other, baffled. What did it mean? And was it important? She did say something important, Miss Maple went on. She's like George. She says important things in ways that a sheep can understand. She said humans are herd animals. I think she's quite right. Miss Maple had forgotten all about grazing now and was trotting up and down, concentrating hard. They all live in the same place, in the village. They come to see the spade together. They're herd animals, like us. We're a flock, but why? Miss Maple stopped trotting. Why does it seem so new to us? Why didn't we know that humans are herd animals? The answer's simple. Miss Maple looked keenly at the sheep around her. From their expressions, she could tell that the answer wasn't simple enough. But just as she was about to go on, Sir Richfield bleated excitedly. He left the flock. George left the flock. Miss Maple nodded. Yes, she said. George must have left the human herd. He never belonged to their flock, or perhaps he was chased away. He was always angry with the people in the village. We all know that. Perhaps his death is a punishment for leaving the flock. The sheep were silent with horror. It seemed terrible to think of their shepherd leaving the flock. But the devil's hounds, whispered Cordelia. He didn't deserve that. Lane shuddered. They must be terrible hounds if even humans are afraid of them. Perhaps the wolf's ghost was really one of the devil's hounds. Despite the sunny weather in the meadow, the thought of the wolf's ghost sent a misty fear creeping through the fleeces of all the sheep. They instinctively moved closer together. Cloud began bleating anxiously. Only Maud made a mocking face. The devil's hounds don't necessarily have to be big, she said. Not when you stop to think how small human souls are. No higher than a sheep's knee, I'd say, at the most. Even a very small dog could cope with them. The sheep thought about the smallest dog they had ever seen. It was about the size of a large turnip, with a golden coat and a flat nose, and it had yapped at them from a woman tourist's arm. Was that what the devil's hounds looked like? Or the wolf's ghost? They didn't have to feel afraid of dogs like that. Miss Maple shook her head impatiently. The important part is that human beings think they have large souls, she said. Beth was right. Humans have to think of the devil's hounds as big and terrible. So why weren't they too frightened to stick that spade into George? The sheep considered this question and came to no conclusion. Maple went on thinking out loud. We know why no one heard George's screams. It was because he didn't scream. He was already dead when someone stuck the spade into him. That's why there was so little blood on the meadow. The sheep were amazed. Now that Miss Maple said it, It was as clear as a pool of clean water in front of them. Miss Maple flapped her ears to shoo away a few flies. But that doesn't explain anything. Why would someone stick a spade in George when he's already dead? An awkward silence. How could a sheep find the answer to such a difficult question? Miss Maple was not discouraged. She trotted briskly back and forth again. Of course, there are more possibilities now. Perhaps there are two different murderers. One who poisoned George, and another who thought he'd killed George with the spade. Or the spade was there to cover up for the real murder. But if you ask me, said Miss Maple, stopping to nibble a few daisies, the spade looks like a stupid trick, like something a couple of lambs might think up together. Perhaps the murderer was brave enough to use the spade because someone else was with him. Later, when the other sheep had scattered and were grazing in the meadow, the lamb, who as yet had no name, stood rooted to the spot where they had conducted this conversation. Snuggling safely into Cloud's soft fleece, he had heard it all. At first it had been mostly the warmth he was after, but deep in Cloud's wool he had begun to tremble. He wished he was brave enough to speak up again in front of all those old, experienced sheep, but would they have believed him? Would they even have listened to him? In the end, he didn't dare. He had wanted to tell them it was all wrong. He wanted to say that Miss Maple, the cleverest sheep in Glenhill, and perhaps the whole world, had made a terrible mistake. Because the wolf's ghost wasn't golden. The wolf's ghost was shaggy and gray. The lamb knew that they mustn't forget the wolf's ghost, because it was still out hunting through the wild hills beyond the meadow. In the evening, when the moon had risen, but the sky hadn't yet turned pale, and everything gave off its deepest, truest scent, you could feel it, the way you could feel darkness, even with your eyes closed. The lamb thought how the wolf's ghost had spread its black wings on the dolmen, and heard its hoarse cry for the second time. The other sheep grazed peacefully around him. But anyone looking more closely could see that the peaceful atmosphere of the meadow was deceptive, and that slowly but surely a small group of daring sheep was assembling behind the shepherd's caravan, where Richfield couldn't see them. These sheep were thinking of leaving the flock. It was Miss Maple's idea. She was absolutely determined to get into the village that evening and eavesdrop on the conversation between Beth and the Red Woman, but not alone. She didn't dare do that again. So she had summoned the bravest sheep in the flock, Zora and Othello, Lane, who thought more pragmatically than any other sheep, Cloud, because she always grazed together anyway, and Mopple, the memory sheep. So far, her proposal had not met with much enthusiasm. "No sheep may leave the flock," bleated Cloud. That said it all, she felt. "But we're not leaving the flock," explained Maple. "If just one sheep goes off on its own, then it's leaving the flock. That was wrong of me. I'll never do it again. No sheep can stand it." Maple shook herself. "But if several sheep go off, 2 or 3 of them, then they can't be leaving the flock, because when they're a little flock of their own." She looked triumphantly around. "We could all go," bleated Cloud. "If we all go, I'll go too." She made a daring face. Maple shook her head. "We can't all go. Beth's whole garden would be swarming with sheep. She'd suspect something." They could all see that. "It has to be only a very few sheep," Miss Maple went on. "Few enough to hide under bushes and in the shadow of the trees. And then if anyone does see them, he'll think they've lost their way. We'll just trot off to Beth's house, listen to what they're saying, and trot back again. Easy." "So, where is Beth's house?" asked Zora. It could be anywhere. Next to the takeaway, near the church, and it's blue, said Miss Maple. But how will we find the takeaway? Oh, but how will we find the takeaway or the church? We don't even know what a church is, said Lane. The sheep prepared for a long and awkward silence, disappointed but also relieved that no one would have to go on this dangerous expedition now. After a suitable interval, they'd go back to grazing. Then Mopple the whale, of all sheep, opened his mouth. They have chips in the takeaway, he murmured, lost in thought between two goes of chewing the cud. You could tell he hadn't really been paying attention. Only when he noticed the silence of the other sheep did he raise his head and look directly at Maple, who was looking back at him with shining eyes. Mopple was the only sheep in the flock with any experience of potato chips. George had once offered him one of those greasy yellow sticks just to prove that he wouldn't like it. Ever afterwards, Mopple had known what chips smelled like, even what they tasted like, and he would remember the smell. Mopple in search of fodder. He would be their radar sheep. It was a dead cert of a plan.
That was quick.
Chapter 10. Geraniums for Mopple. There was a small and uninteresting square in the middle of Glenhill, containing 4 neglected trees, a park bench, a marble column with an inscription on it, and a hedge that would make good cover for a sheep. The hedge cast 2 shadows. One was a dull shadow shown in golden light, the other was sharp and glaringly outlined. On one side of the square stood a house with a pointed roof, lit up with gold by the floodlights. On the other shone the cold neon lighting of the takeaway. Darkness lurked behind the takeaway, and 3 sheep were lurking the darkness. Maple, Othello, and Mopple the whale had set off at dusk to listen in on the conversation between Beth and the Red Woman. Mopple was looking cross. He had been promised chips to induce him to take part in this expedition, but then Maple and Othello had chased him rapidly past the door of the takeaway. Now he was staring through the window with them, obliged to watch Beth inside, consuming a plateful of raw food, kohlrabi, carrots, radishes, celery, with a big red apple for afters. To see anything at all, Mopple had to prop his front hooves on an upside-down bench under the window box and crane his neck. This unusual position was beginning to make his back ache. Alarming sounds came from the street, the noise of car engines, men laughing, dogs barking. The yard where the sheep stood absorbed these sounds and flung them back and forth between the walls of the house and the other wall and the blank side of the garage. After finishing her supper, Beth stood up. She had left a carrot, 3 radishes, a stick of celery, and half the big red apple uneaten. Mopple felt hopeful again, but Beth carried the plate out of the room and came back empty-handed. She sat down in an armchair and busied herself with a string of wooden beads. She let the beads slip through her fingers, murmuring to herself, "Our Father who art in heaven." When determined footsteps finally passed the takeaway and came into the yard, Beth was so busy that she didn't even seem to notice. But the sheep knew at once who was purposefully coming round the corner, casting a clear, neon-lit shadow on the ground. She still smelled of earth and sun and good health, even if those delightful aromas were now partly muted by cigarette smoke. Mopple began squinting uneasily at the backyard for their escape route, but the sheep stayed put. They had rehearsed it in advance. If the Red Woman went no further than the door, They were well hidden from sight from behind a bush of broom. The woman knocked, and Beth jumped in her armchair. She quickly put the string of beads away, traced a sign in front of her breast with her right thumb, and hurried to the door. Then Beth inside the house and the woman outside the house both disappeared from the sheep's field of vision, and all they could hear was an indistinct murmuring. It was exciting. They had never seen a human house from the inside. Obviously, going in and going out were not the same thing. The door of the room opened, and the red woman came through it, not red at all this time, but wearing blue trousers and a green shirt, followed by Beth. "Rebecca," said the woman as she entered the room. "Please call me Rebecca." But Beth said nothing. The two of them looked at each other in silence for a while. "You're not here to help the tourist trade," said Beth at last. "You're here because of George." Rebecca nodded. "I want to find out as much as possible about his life and his death. If I can give the tourist trade of Glenhill a boost at the same time, then that's fine by me." Her smile was ironic, but Beth did not notice. "Why, are you from the police? Goodness knows it's about time they did something at last." Rebecca blushed. "No," she said. "I'm here for personal reasons." Beth narrowed her eyes. "But you don't know anything about him," she said. "That doesn't leave very many alternatives." Rebecca lowered her eyes and said nothing. "So you come to me about it?" Beth's voice was agitated, much as it was when she pressed the tracts into George's hands. "Me, of all people? I thought you were a respectable woman. I ought to send you away. With a copy of the gospel, yes, but I ought to send you away. What do you want here?" Rebecca was still smiling, but it was a much sadder smile now. "You'd probably call it forgiveness," she said quietly. Rebecca's reply did, with the utmost ease, something that none of George's sharp remarks had ever managed. It left Beth thunderstruck. Rebecca's slim hands traced curving lines on a chest of drawers, while Beth stood like a weeping willow on a very calm day. Mopple was getting bored. He reached his neck out, tasted one of the geraniums in the window box, and chewed noisily. Othello cast him an irritated glance. Mopple looked back innocently. On the other side of the glass pane, Beth had turned white as a sheet. "My God," she whispered. "My God." Then a new idea seemed to occur to her. She calmed down slightly. "Tea?" Rebecca nodded. There was a bump outside. Mopple had leaned too far over in his quest for a geranium bud and lost his balance, and was now sitting on his behind. Othello snorted. "Mopple, if you touch another petal, I'm going to chase you all over the meadow tomorrow until you're as thin as an old nanny goat." Mopple stopped chewing and clambered to his feet again. Maple looked sternly at both friends. The three of them took up their observation posts in the shadow of the geraniums once more. But Beth and Rebecca had disappeared. Instead, there was the clink of china. "You won't find anything out," said Beth's voice. "Not by asking people?" "As scandalous as that?" asked Rebecca's voice. "Unspeakable," said Beth's voice. "Unspeakable, if only because no one really knows anything. The whole village is rotted away like an apple, if you see what I mean. From the inside out, like an apple." Mopple made a face. It had been a mistake, trotting off to this village. He was about to get down from the window box when Miss Maple discovered what had happened to Beth and Rebecca. They hadn't disappeared at all. They had just sunk into two low armchairs, and now the geraniums hid them from view. "Look at that," said Beth. Something rustled on the tabletop. "Oh," said Rebecca. Beth laughed in a forced kind of way. "It doesn't get really interesting until I tell you where I found it." Maple could stand it no longer. "Mopple, she bleated, quietly, but as firmly as a lead ram. Go ahead, then. Eat those geraniums. Eat us a hole through the geraniums. Quick. Mopple was the fastest eater in all Glenkill. A few geranium plants would be nothing to him. But Mopple didn't move. He stood between Maple and Othello, looking as if he had indigestion. Mopple the whale! Miss Maple was angrier than she had been in a long time. Mopple looked at her unhappily and turned his head to Othello. Eat them, growled Othello through his teeth. A short time later there was devastation where the geraniums had recently been growing and thriving. Beyond the devastation, the sheep could see Beth and Rebecca sitting at the table. From inside the room, it looked as if Beth had planted 3 sheep's heads in her window box. But luckily, neither of the 2 women thought of looking out of the window. They were far too deep in conversation anyway. You could call it some silly boy's trick, said Beth. Said Rebecca. They both looked at the small bundle of straw lying on the table between them. Someone had tied the straw together into the shape of arms, legs, and a head. Someone had stuck a twig right through the straw body. Do you know what the children used to call George? Goblin King. Imagine that. Where did they get that from? Such heathens. Only behind his back, of course. Oh, yes, they feared him like the Prince of... Rebecca nodded. And so you thought? A silly boy's prank. It wouldn't have been the first time. Beth sighed. I found this one morning last week on the steps of George's caravan. I never gave up hope for him, you know, even though he laughed at me. But he wasn't at home. He'd been away quite often lately, so I took the thing with me. I thought those kids and their nonsense about the Goblin King weren't worth bothering about. And now I think it was a warning, and it's my fault he didn't get it. Beth smiled sadly. But never mind. George wouldn't have listened to me anyway. If there's one thing I know, it's that George never listened to warnings. They fell silent. Why was he away so often recently? Asked Rebecca. What was he doing when he wasn't there? Beth folded her hands. I wish I knew. He dressed well when he went away, in a suit and white shirt. He looked 10 years younger and a real gentleman. That makes people talk, of course, but I don't believe a word of it. I think he went up to town, to Dublin, to offices and banks and so on. He wanted to get away from here, you see, away from Glenkill. But someone or other didn't want him to go away? Asked Rebecca. Beth nodded. Was he having an affair? Horrified, Beth shook her head. Rebecca raised her eyebrows. Then she asked, Do you think it was about money? Beth laughed her forced laugh again. I expect that's what they're all wondering here. Money is all they can think of. What heathens! Did George have money anyway? Normally, I'd have said no. Not the way he lived. A bit of land, a few sheep, a little house, and not much business. Most people here have more. Most of them earn quite well from the tourists, though of course they all complain. But then again, sometimes George did have things, expensive things, really expensive. A watch. No one in all Glenkill could have afforded a watch like that. Not even Baxter, the pub landlord, even though he's getting fat on the bed and breakfast business. Figuratively speaking, I mean. If you ever see him, you'll know why I say figuratively speaking. Beth giggled like a schoolgirl. And George thought nothing of that expensive watch, she went on. He wore it when he was sowing radishes. Beth's hands played with the straw doll. A furtive trace of something like admiration had crept into her voice. So, now of course everyone's waiting for the will to be opened. It's going to be this coming Sunday, out of doors. A lawyer will come from town. George told the lawyer just what he wanted. Money is what interests these heathens. Believe you me, They've never waited for anything more eagerly, not even the feeble-minded sheep competition. The smartest sheep in Glenkill contest, said Rebecca, smiling too. The ultimate tourist magnet, and now George goes and steals the show. They should save themselves the trouble, said Beth. The things they do to animals, it's ridiculous. But I have to be going now, off to spread the word. One arm of the straw doll had come apart, so it looked as if it were holding a tuft of hay in its hand. Beth's thin fingers expertly wrapped a single blade of straw around the tuft until the doll was mended. Maple realized that she was feeling uncomfortable, from her hooves to the ends of her fleece. It was as if her ears were stuffed with wool, as if the glass of the window pane between them and Beth was clouded over like smoke. She could hear and see, but she felt as if she were standing in fog. It took her a moment to work out where that feeling came from. She couldn't smell Beth and Rebecca on the other side of the pane. There was no scent to let her know if they were telling the truth about what they felt and what they feared. It was a ghostly, incomplete world. It must always be like that for human beings, with their small souls and their sticking out noses. It meant distrust, uncertainty, anxiety. Changeable, capricious, Beth was just saying. I don't believe it. The human heart is a strange thing. It can cling to only one thing in life, and where it clings it stays, for good or bad. The sheep were astonished. They had never heard Beth talk about anything but the gospel and doing good works. She called everything else idle chat. And suddenly she was just chatting idly away without pressing a single tract into Rebecca's hand. In this new and careless mood, she was a bit like a lamb, bold and vulnerable at the same time. She must be very worked up indeed. Take Ham, for instance, said Beth. Rebecca looked at her blankly. Ham? Abraham Rackham, the butcher, Beth explained, her grave face twisted into a smile. If you want to find out anything here, you have to understand the way the locals think. Abraham is too long a name for them, of course. More than 2 syllables in your name, and it hasn't a chance. She thought for a moment. There are exceptions, of course. Gabriel. Funny, I never thought of that before. No one here would dare call him Gabe. But Ham, when you see him, you'll see why. Abe would probably have been more normal. They're not very inventive around here, but we already have an Abe. And then those 2 Hams in the name, and his job. Oh, you should just see him. What about Ham, then? I'd start with him if I were you. He always acts so pious, as if he was the only man in the world who ever read the Bible. But people are afraid of him, and he himself, he is afraid too. In his butcher shop, he has a CCTV camera. He's had it for ages, even when we only knew about such things from American movies. But why does a butcher shop need a camera like that? They don't even have one at the bank. I think he's genuinely scared, which means he has something to hide. That's what I think. I did once tell him so at the Christmas collection in church. And he went red. He was angry, embarrassed, and Ham's not a man to get embarrassed easily. I don't like to think what might be found in his slaughterhouse. God be with us. Marple's stomach was making funny noises. Othello looked at him reproachfully. Rebecca passed her tongue over her lips. This is a strange place. It's not the way I imagined it. I thought it would be peaceful here. It was peaceful once, said Beth. Not peaceful enough, obviously. Beth shook her head. I don't mean just before George's death. I mean much earlier. Years ago. Beth thought briefly. 7 years ago. I spent 6 months in Africa, and when I came back it was all different. More superstition, less of the fear of the Lord, and George was more affected than anyone. And after that he became more and more of a recluse. After that, oh, I don't know. So, what happened? Nothing, of course, said Beth bitterly. They were very keen to say that nothing had happened, but since then, and Beth leaned forward again, since then, they've been waiting for something to save them. Mopple's knees began to tremble. He slid off the window box and stared glassily at the garage wall. His scent was suddenly as sour as fermenting rowan berries. Mopple rolled his eyes. Colic. Mopple the whale, who could eat any amount of fresh clover on an empty stomach, had colic. Those geraniums must be vicious as a wolf. Othello and Maple flanked Mopple, one each side, to prevent him from lying down. Waking up and down was the Walking up and down was the only cure for that sort of colic. They had learned that from George. Keep going, whispered Maple. Take another step, another step. And don't bleat, Mopple, muttered Othello. Mopple stumbled forward, eyes glazed, but he didn't bleat. Maple and Othello helped him to walk up and down the backyard of the takeaway. Then the door suddenly opened and a great drift of Beth's sour smell wafted out. It was as if she kept the essence of her scent indoors and took only a little of it with her when she left home. Rebecca's full, warm scent wove its way, sleek as a ferret, through this sour, aromatic wasteland. Then she was standing in the yard. Mopple, Maple, and Othello just made it into the shelter behind the broom bush. Thank you very much, said Rebecca to the desolate scent standing in the doorframe. That was a great help to me, especially when you told me the last. She smiled mischievously. And now I'm hungry. Do you think the takeaway will still be open? Not in a place like this, said the voice in the doorway, but I can give you a bite to eat, bread and some salad. Thank you very much, but no. Rebecca smiled again and took a couple of steps towards the street before turning. There's one thing I don't understand, she said. You obviously don't think much of Glenkill. Why did you stay here? Silence from the doorway. Then, let's say, for very personal reasons, breathed a voice that none of the sheep would have recognized as Beth's. George? Asked Rebecca, but the door was already closed. Rebecca strolled across the yard and disappeared around the corner. Not before time, either, as Mopple was writhing in agony. They forced him to walk back across the yard, Maple whispering comforting words into his ear, Othello muttering threats. After a while, Mopple stopped. Come on, keep going, bleated Maple. Othello nuzzled Mopple none too gently in the side. No, said Mopple weakly. You must, growled Othello. No, I mustn't, said Mopple. Don't you understand? It's over. I'm hungry. When the three sheep left the yard of the takeaway again, it was quiet in the streets. Mopple was still rather shaky on his legs, but he ate a few flowers planted by some unthinking human around the marble column. Miss Maple set off back to the meadow, but after only a few steps she noticed that Othello wasn't following. The black ram had stopped and was standing beside the marble column, like a small, dark cloud. Maple bleated encouragingly to him, but Othello shook his head. I'll stick around here, said Othello. Maple flapped her ears forward, wondering why, but Othello just looked mysterious, and next moment he had disappeared into the shadow of the hedge. Miss Maple would have liked to follow him, but Mopple the whale smelled confused. He smelled of streaming eyes and trembling knees, and she didn't want to leave him alone now. Together they trotted back towards the meadow. Mopple's eyes were still a little glazed. Maple trotted along beside him more briskly than she had trotted for some time. That was interesting, she said. Wouldn't you like to know what happened 7 years ago, too? What an enormous length of time. Maple was the cleverest sheep in all Glenhill, but even she couldn't imagine 7 years. She tried 7 summers, no reaction. 7 winters, she could only really remember last winter, when George had nailed an old carpet over the door of the hay barn to protect them from the cold wind. There was a winter before that, and another before that one. Then the trail of winters was lost in the dark. Mopple had been following his own train of thought. It was the butcher, he groaned. Why? Maple looked at Mopple in concern. Just because he has a CCTV camera? We don't even know what a CCTV camera is. Mopple looked stubborn. No one likes the butcher, Maple went on thoughtfully. All the same, those men under the lime tree were afraid he might die. She shook her head. There's so much fear around here. Everyone's afraid. It's a wonder that George felt so little fear. But they tried to frighten him, said Mopple, with straw. He shook his head at the thought of such human folly. There were plenty of terrible, horrible things in the world, but straw was surely not among them. Maple nodded. A warning. She had an idea, and stopped. Mopple looked questioningly at her. Mopple, said Maple, if a small figure like that, with a stick stuck through it, was meant to be a little warning to George, could it be that George, with a spade stuck into him, was meant to be a huge, big warning to someone else? Mopple looked blank, but Maple wasn't really expecting an answer. She was busy with her thoughts. The children were afraid of George, but why? What was so scary about George that so many people could be afraid of him? Mopple, she said, please remember this. Goblin King. Goblin King, puffed Mopple.